members of my band. Here on my side, my good friend and great singer, Jovanka Ostiana. On guitar, Mr. Ed Verhoef. On percussion from New York, Mr. Bruno Saturnino. On drums, my little brother, not so little anymore, but okay, Roel Kalister. On bass, Mr. Reno Steva. On piano, Mr. Mark Bishop. And we have there is my sound man. I would like to give him an applause to Mr. Julio Hernandez. Hey, hey, la 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 para su pista t'arriba bossa. Dimas con anche t'avaria pavo. Ai machate che cubota stimami. Favor non ingami e baile de amor. Ai pavo e tabula e papaya. E cubo en tabarda energía. Ai machate
My name is John Otis. I'm based in Bogota, Colombia, but I pretty much cover most of Latin America. Flying into Honduras after getting into the airport, it was about a four and a half hour drive. The town isn't such great shakes. I mean, it's this normal little burg, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. But the real beauty of the area is kind of the outlying area, the area surrounding the town. It's these rolling hills and mountains that are covered mostly with coffee fincas, and the coffee country out there is just really beautiful. Ariel Benitez, the mayor of San Juan, was really one of the very first mayors in Honduras to take it seriously, and along with some help with some NGOs, he helped put together one of Honduras's first climate adaptation plans. The climate adaptation plan is pretty straightforward. It's not this big bureaucratic tome. It's 29 pages. It's actually quite readable, and that's a good thing because it's something that the peasant farmers who live in and around San Juan can actually read and understand, and it can help prevent coffee rust, which is this terrible plague that has wiped out millions of acres of coffee over the decades. Farmers had set up a community bank, and they were giving out small loans so people could try their hands at setting up little businesses. Some people were using the fruits that they had planted, like blackberries and oranges and pineapples, and fermenting them into wine and selling the wine for $6 a bottle, and they were making a good little side income on that. Some other folks we met up with there had set up a bakery, which doesn't sound anything too sophisticated, but it was really the only bakery in that part of the countryside. I met Otilia Aguilar. She and her husband had 4 young children, and several years back they lost their whole crop to the coffee rust plague, and they were pretty determined to pull up stakes and head towards the United States. In the end, they ended up staying because they didn't want to leave their 4 kids behind. Again, having a little bit of cash is really important in adapting to climate change. And they were able to plant some new strains of coffee that held up better to coffee rust and plant some other crops as well.
All right, good morning, buenos dias. I'm Brian Winter, the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly. The climate change crisis continues to have huge consequences throughout Latin America, prompting many people to migrate northward to the United States. Just last week, I was actually in Chile, where a record-breaking drought is now in its 13th year. What used to be considered a Mediterranean climate is now becoming more like semi-desert. And officials just announced a plan unprecedented in the 500-year almost history of Santiago that will likely ration water, restrict water pressure, and then move on potentially to rotating water cuts of up to 24 hours for parts of the city. That's just one example of a phenomenon that is costing lives, economic growth, and is fueling migration throughout the hemisphere. A recent IPCC report said that reducing carbon is important, but it's just simply not enough, that we need to spend money adapting our economies and cities to become more resilient in the face of these changes. Our recent issue of America's Quarterly shows how some creative, small-scale adaptation projects are already underway through the story of some rural farmers in Honduras. Some of you were just seeing a video that explains a little bit what people are doing, rotating crops, starting bakeries. It's pretty cool, actually. But let's be clear, effective solutions will require efforts on a much bigger scale. And our panel today will explore ways to make that happen, to examine which projects work best at making countries and cities and rural areas more resilient in the face of a changing climate, what challenges stand in the way, and crucially, how to get more of these projects funded by private banks, multilaterals, and other institutions. We have 3 panelists today who will speak to various aspects of these challenges. It's a great group. We're happy to be hosting this event in partnership with CEBRI, the Centro Brasileiro de Relações Internacionais. So thank you to them as well. We thought we'd start the conversation by talking to our panelist who is there on the ground in Honduras. Jose Daniel Madrigal is an economic specialist at the Honduras Resident Coordinator's Office of the United Nations. Jose Daniel, buenos dias. What do you see in terms of climate adaptation projects in a place like Honduras, which is one of the world's most vulnerable countries to climate change, but there aren't many resources to deal with it? And what are the biggest challenges that you see standing in the way of more of these projects?
Well, yeah, Brian, thank you for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank America's Quarterly for this conversation, as well as America's Society, Council of the Americas, and CEBRI, as you mentioned, and to my fellow panelists for being here. I'm sure this will be a really interesting conversation. Having said that, Brian, I would like to echo some of your words right now in terms of it's people at the end of the day who suffer the most from these impacts from climate change. Our region is highly exposed, and which adds up to high levels of inequalities, poverty, housing deficits, high population density, among other structural factors and weaknesses that you all know about. In terms of extreme events, as you mentioned, the region suffers from warming temperatures, from droughts, from hurricanes, and just in Honduras, and in Central America overall, we had Eta and Iota 2 years ago, which was really devastating. Therefore, climate adaptation is critical for our efforts, and I would respond to your question in several points. First, I would argue that social inclusion towards effective adaptation measures have not been sufficient. It is critical that we include those sectors of society that have normally been excluded from decision-making processes and development models in our region. When I mention these sectors of society, I mean indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, youth, women, to name a few. It is essential, as we say in the UN, to leave no one behind in this transition. Regarding civil society, I also think there are challenges in there because many times they lack the technical and financial capacity, as you have well noted, to execute adaptation projects, despite possessing local knowledge which would be really invaluable for all these efforts. They need support, and I do believe that we would contribute towards capacity building and tackling asymmetries of information, of economic power and political power, which are really just transversal to all these efforts in our region. Second, I would like to if I may, I would like to mention I believe there's this connection between national level adaptation planning instruments such as policies, laws, strategies overall, and the subnational level. We were watching in the video right at the beginning of this event that San Juan in Tibucá in Honduras is a good example, but unfortunately, it's just an exception to the rule. So concretely, UNEP mentioned that globally speaking, 79% of countries have a national adaptation instrument, while only 26% of countries have subnational level adaptation instruments. So I do believe there is an opportunity over there, and I do think that we could see benefits by encouraging a better coordination between different levels in our countries, and that will also help in terms of having better measures, having better metrics in terms of the adaptation needed, and would help in terms of considering putting projects into the pipeline towards better financing through public public-private partnerships. And I'm sure Reina and Laura will talk more about this, as this is their area of expertise every day. And finally, I would like to mention, Brian, the importance of a region where economic formality and access to finance is common to everyone and not just to a few. According to information of 16 countries from the region, the International Labour Organization mentions that approximately 53% of Latin Americans, which means 130 million people, basically were in informality during 2016. And as you can imagine, the COVID-19 pandemic probably has intensified this phenomenon. So I believe that if we tackle this circumstance, we would be contributing towards sustainable growth and social safety nets towards the moment when extreme events do occur, and towards this climate crisis that we're actually seeing right now. That would be it, Brian. Thank you.
Jose, let me ask you just one more quick question, if I may, before we open things up to the rest of the group. I was so struck by this story that the Bogota-based journalist John Otis wrote, where he went into rural Honduras, and I couldn't figure out, honestly, whether to be encouraged or depressed by the fact that this was happening. Because encouraged, obviously, because it's a good project, but perhaps a little upset because it did seem so precarious and kind of artisanal. Do you sense that the best projects these days are coming from the grassroots, or does there need to be sort of more of a top-down thing, more action at the national level?
Yes, Brian, I think it has to be both. So at the end of the day, I do believe that there's plenty of local knowledge from indigenous communities, from local communities overall, from civil society, from young people, that we are not taking the best advantage in a good sense. But I do believe that those local knowledges also has to be in a way directed by planning instruments, be it at the subnational level, as I mentioned, but also at the national level. And that also helps in terms of looking for the finance that we need to execute those projects. I do believe that even though there is local knowledge, like you mentioned, these artisanal kind of projects, we also need kind of a more a more coordinated approach between the regional and global agenda and the local agenda, which we face the same problems, but at the end of the day, there are particular realities that we need to consider in order to have real sustainable projects, not only in terms of reducing emissions or in terms of augmenting resilience, but also in terms of social aspects and economic dimensions.
Well, thank you, Jose Daniel, for that perfect segue, which takes us from, we wanted to have kind of a micro on the ground perspective to start things off. And now let's see if we can really do the big picture and talk about how to execute more of these projects, not different kinds of projects, bigger projects, and this critical question of how to pay for it. Where does the money come from, and how do we match funding with some of these good ideas on the ground? So to do that, I'd like to now bring in our other two panelists. Reina Irene Mejia Chacon is the Executive Vice President at the Inter-American Development Bank and a friend of America's Quarterly, who has been on our panels before. And then Laura Segafredo is the Global Head of Sustainable Research, ETF and Index Investments at BlackRock. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being here. Let me ask both of you the same question, but Reina, I'd like to start with you. And the question is, what in your experience or the experience of your institution have been the most effective projects for climate change adaptation in Latin America, and why?
Thank you, Brian, for your invitation. I'm honored to share with you our experience. Climate change continues to have far-reaching impacts through floods, fire, heat waves, and more intense and damaging storms. The most vulnerable communities are the ones that will be the most impacted. However, the specific effects will depend on which country and the local vulnerabilities of the communities, as Jose Daniel was mentioning earlier. Back to your question, we could say that there are 4 categories of effective projects. Those focus on disaster risk management, like cross-stakeholders governance, early warning systems, communications, and related financial instruments for rapid response. Second, will be strengthening social protection and health system. The third one is so crucial for our survival, is the one that is related to water, both in terms of supply and quality of water. And the fourth is what you just, your team just mentioned, and you highlighted in America's Quarterly, and the video that you showed is projects that ensure climate resilience in areas like agriculture, livestock, and the natural resources sector. Which, by the way, they're so key for our Central American countries. In terms of stakeholders governance, it's very important. The IDB has developed a tool to evaluate governance in disaster risk management. This tool will help countries, helps countries to identify their own readiness to deal with natural disasters. This is about ensuring the engagement and flows of information across all the sectors. Mexico is a great example on this. We believe that Mexico, in my opinion, is one of the most prepared countries in our region from a governance perspective. However, in Central America, well, we have made progress, and we've seen it in the number of deaths, but we still have ways to go. Brian, this is such an important topic that I could go on because we know that all sectors are already being impacted by climate change. I mean, nothing is excluded: tourism, mining, energy, transport, housing. And let's remember, as you mentioned before, it's not only about designing and financing the projects on adaptation, but this requires a big cultural change in our labor force. And the question is our labor force skilled for these projects? How are we training them? Yes, it's a great opportunity, but we have in our hands an even bigger challenge. So.
Well, I've written down 3 follow-up questions I want to ask you just based on what you said, but let me come back to you and let me open up the floor now to Laura. Laura, you know Latin America well. You have a global remit, however, and that is one that I think can help at times like this. This same question for you. I mean, what in your experience in inside both the region that we're talking about today, but in the globe as a whole, what have been the most effective adaptation projects for climate change and why?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me today. So I'll start with just a couple figures that I think are helpful for context. The needs for investment in adaptation are probably going to be of the order of 300 billion per year around 2030. I'm quoting figures, estimates from the World Bank Group and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. Now, it's true that investment in climate adaptation is trending upwards across both private and public sources. However, we know two things. First is that we're not investing enough in adaptation. And the second is that only about 2% currently of the capital that's flowing to adaptation finance comes from private sources. So it's a very small percentage, and that has to change. We also know that currently of that money that's spent, mostly private capital that's spent on adaptation, most of that is flowing towards higher income countries and not the lower income countries where communities are trying to survive the impacts of the climate crisis today already. So clearly that has to change. Now, in terms of what some of the models that have worked so far, I think that there are some hopeful opportunities here. And the one that I want to focus on is really the example of green bonds. For those who are unfamiliar with green bonds are fixed income instruments where the proceeds of the sale of the bond have to be earmarked for projects that have some positive environmental impacts. And those can be across a variety of different categories. They can be renewable energy, they can be energy efficiency, green buildings, water efficiency or conservation, land use conservation, etc. And adaptation, climate adaptation is one of those categories. That is a market that has grown from 0 to more than $1 trillion in the last 12 years or so. The first issuance was, well, they kind of debate whether it was the World Bank or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but certainly it came from the Multilateral Development Bank. So that's an interesting way that multilaterals have really catalyzed and created a market. They function as aggregator of projects, and then private capital is flowing into this. Now, what's happened in this market is really interesting. In 2016, the first sovereign, so country, has issued a green bond. So now countries, we see that there's been a flurry of issuances, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe and in Latin America. There's been some really great examples, and I'll talk about that. But basically, countries are using these instruments of debt issuance to essentially demonstrate that they are committed to the ambition that they've obviously stated in international climate negotiations, for example, in the context of the Paris Agreement and having to present these plans to decarbonize their own economy. But obviously, it's also a way to ensure that that private money can flow into these projects. Now, we have been active in this market for a long time. In fact, before this role in the ETF and index platform at BlackRock, I was working in fixed income, and we have built our capabilities to really invest in green, social, and sustainable bonds over the years. And so there's a lot of learning that we have gained through that. And of course, we also have launched funds, commingled fund, the mutual fund, and also an ETF in the US that invest exclusively in these instruments. And I think that it's really a testament to the growth of this market, how interesting this is. Fixed income investors can add these bonds or these funds to their portfolios without changing anything in their asset allocation. It's a simple bond. It carries the same credit risk as the issuer. There's nothing idiosyncratic about the project. It's really, truly a way that you can substitute an exposure for something that has positive environmental benefits. Now, some of the examples, one of the examples in Latin America of countries that have issued green bonds is Chile. And Chile has been a really interesting one. So part of the proceeds of their bonds, they've done several, include upgrades to their water infrastructure. And that's especially where water reserves are scarce and have been hit by severe droughts over the years. Now, as we know, persistent droughts, we've talked about it just now, Reina has talked about it, and then in the video that was also mentioned, persistent droughts and the unavailability of water threaten people's livelihoods today. They increase the risk of disease and death. They fuel mass migration, and that fuels instability. So there's a lot of butterfly effects related to water scarcity. Millions of people have been displaced already as a result of drought. About 700 million people are at risk of being displaced by 2030 because of it. And so since Chile is entering its 13th year of severe drought, projects like this one have been really effective, and they're needed to help the country adapt to a changing climate and to avoid some of the catastrophic social ripple effects that we're seeing in other parts of the region and in other parts of the world. So we're really happy to offer our clients this kind of opportunities, but we definitely need more adaptation projects and products in the region. Our work's not done.
Yeah, well, so Laura, you mentioned this figure, this $300 billion a year needed for these adaptation efforts, but only 2% of it is coming from the private sector. And I have to admit, when Reina, when you were talking about the kinds of projects that are important, I was thinking to myself, this fundamental question of how do you get the private sector to invest in projects like that, because none of them, and perhaps it's just my ignorance on this, but none of them strike me as kind of fabulously profitable projects. So how do you bridge that gap? I mean, is this, at the end of the day, are these projects that multilateral banks like the IDB will inevitably have to fund, or are there barriers that can be removed to make them more attractive for private investors as well?
Okay. That's a great question, Brian. The first and most significant barrier to getting this project funded is a lack of awareness of both the risk and the importance of managing this risk. Another challenge is the uncertainty of future climate impacts. And this is because it's very difficult to project future weather patterns. And the data actually is quite alarming. So it takes only one extreme weather, and I know we have seen it, and everybody spoke about it. It only takes one extreme weather event a year in Central America to the country to increase the fiscal deficit to almost 1%.
Wow.
So the third point here is, okay, we need adaptation, and how we're going to get it financed. We know that companies are still struggling to have a clear cost-benefit analysis on the importance of adaptation. They're also looking for a way to reduce their investment risk, and this is where governments have a big role in establishing clear and consistent policies and regulations. We know governments are facing challenges, especially on their enforcement on the policies, and a call for, this is a call for all of us. Let's not change the rules in the middle of the game. And as you know, at the IDB, we accompany governments in this journey. Our private sector window also has a role, and I'm glad that you mentioned, Laura, the first issuance in the green bond was Chile, and we supported Chile to do that. So we are dedicating significant technical resource to generate knowledge, showing the value added of adaptation. This is where working together, the public, the private, and the development organizations come in. And I call this the triad. There is no way we're going to do it. We're going to do it alone, Brian. And I understand that, Laura was mentioning multilaterals, lenders, and bilateral donors have been vital actors in financing climate resilience projects. However, there is a growing recognition, and Laura just mentioned, for the private finance. We all seen the numbers. And I believe that Paris Agreement and other international agreements have increased both private and public understanding of the importance of their participation in building adapted capacities and ensuring climate resilience. So the policies, I will say, are the first step on the road to developing investment plans, understanding fiscal implications, and developing financing plans that will increasingly include the private finance. So, and thanks, Laura, for mentioning the importance of green bonds. I remember 10 to 12 years ago, it was not mentioned in green bonds, was not as trendy to talk about it as it is now. And this showed that we have moved the needle. So last year, we issued an innovative solution called the Green Bond Transparency Platform at the IDB. I love this tool, and it's used to promote the harmonization and standardization of reporting. And this is crucial, not only for investors, but also for the issuers, and is designated to increase investors' confidence in the green bond markets and facilitate green investment in the region. This has become a key reporting instrument for the Latin American and the Caribbean green bond markets. It covers around 73% of the market. So there are many things have been done. We still need to continue on this path, and working together with the private sector and the other organization. I mean, the governments and civil society is crucial. There's no way we're going to do it alone.
Reina, I do want to bring Laura and also ask Jose Daniel a question. First, though, two things. One, I'd like to invite those of you who have joined us via Zoom this morning to submit any questions that you may have through the Q&A chat function. But Reina, just quickly, I wanted to follow up on something you said, citing Mexico as an example. Why? What is it that they've gotten right that some other countries have not quite honed in on yet in terms of making this space more both attractive and, from what I'm hearing from you now, just predictability is also such an important thing?
Yes, when I mentioned Mexico was in terms of cross-stakeholder governance, and this is involving, as Jose Daniel was saying, it's not only central government, but you need the municipalities, you need civil society, you need the information to flow, and that is critical. And I said, yes, we have advanced significantly in Central America. I mean, I remember when Mitch happened. And I can also recall recently the IOTA and ETA and IOTA could have been even worse if we didn't have that, but we still need more. So when I quoted and cited Mexico, I was talking specifically on the cross-stakeholder governance. However, there are other countries that we can mention. Brian, we have 26 member countries in the region, and many have been doing a great job with regulatory frameworks. For example, Colombia, Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. They have included a strong adaptation component in their national determined contributions in their NDCs. And they have also developed national adaptation plans, climate change laws, and have strengthened national disaster risk management policies and standards. So, on this end, on the policy front, we continue working across several countries to provide analysis for increased ambition in NDCs and to support long-term transversal planning of adaptation actions. We want the good actions to be followed. And I know you mentioned Mexico, but I also want to give credit to Colombia and Peru. I mean, we have helped them identify physical climate risk and cost and develop adaptation pathways. We are designing a new phase of this work to help municipalities build adaptation pathways in Colombia, including investments across infrastructure, agriculture, forest, and urban sectors. So it's all, horizontal, but also, in a vertical and transversal. So as you know, there is an increased, interest on these matters, and we're starting to see it, and we're starting to see it. The funds are flowing a little bit more with the green bonds being a powerful tool for mobilizing investment to meet the climate targets. And if I may, just want to mention something interesting, that the issuance in the region, grew from 13 billion to 30 billion in the last 2 years, more than double. And this shows the appetite of the public sector and the private sector, as Laura was mentioning. But at the IDB, we have our sights much higher than this. So, and key for this is ensuring that investors and external stakeholders have the confidence that their investment, it's truly being directed to green and sustainable projects. So,
all right, thank you, Reina. Laura, over to you. As I mentioned at the beginning, you work with a global focus, and And look, this question about which countries do best, I think, is important because it helps us kind of identify the specific factors that help create an environment for the kind of growth that Reina just described. Which countries have the best practices around the world? Are any of them in Latin America? If so, which ones? And what can the others learn specifically from some of these best practices that we see in some other countries globally?
Yeah, so thank you. There are several examples of good projects that have been funded through private investments around the world in the adaptation space. There's obviously Chile, but I think there's others, and in particular in Europe, that I would like to focus on because those are really great examples, and in particular the Netherlands. Now, the Dutch government has also issued several green bonds. For context, the Netherlands is similar to countries in the Caribbean, such as Guyana or Suriname or Honduras or Guatemala, in that it's naturally vulnerable to certain climate change events, particularly flooding. Much of the Netherlands, as we all know, lies below sea level and is protected by dikes, by levees, and by seawalls. Now, massive floods, as we've known for centuries, have inundated the country, and they periodically happen, and they often cause extensive damage to the environment and unfortunately also to people. They cause loss of life, etc. In response, the Dutch have become obviously a well-known world leader in engineering solutions to rising sea levels. But also really as a nation, they're heavily invested in fighting climate change because their survival depends on adapting to really rising sea levels, et cetera, and these events becoming more frequent and more severe. So the green bond, so the Dutch government has issued several green bonds, but really the way that they have structured around adaptation projects, they have basically raised money for specific infrastructure projects, such as the use of nature-based solutions. That's really interesting. And green infrastructure approaches for reducing flood risks in coastal and in low-lying areas. The bonds obviously, so like there's several examples. I can go a little bit. For example, in the province of South Holland, there's a project that looks at stopping the erosion of sand dunes and shoals. Basically, there's a system to address this through regular sand nourishment, which means replacing the lost sand with material that was dredged elsewhere. So they call it basically like a sand motor that mimics the natural structure and movement of dunes by continually replenishing the sand while providing primary sea defense. This is something that can be applied elsewhere, in particular in those areas that I mentioned earlier in Latin America. I think really, you know, going back to green bonds, the beauty of them is that, so a couple of things. I think when you talk about the sort of problems, why are we seeing more money flowing through adaptation? I think that one of the reasons is that while it's very easy to sell people on the opportunities related to mitigation, for example, or there are going to be companies that will innovate and find solutions and they will be the winners on the market. That's a great story of an opportunity that also solves a problem. I think it's a little harder in adaptation because it's really hard to link revenues to adaptation projects. And so how do you structure a financial instrument around that? And that's why I think that it's adaptation projects fit really well within that market where there's no upside, there's only downside, but still investors want exposure to these kinds of projects. So that's why I think the beauty of putting these kinds of projects into green bonds is super helpful. And like Reina was saying, honestly, we see an appetite from our clients that is essentially unlimited for these kinds of instruments. A lot of our clients have made commitments to net zero. A lot of our clients want to demonstrate that they are helping and they are financing solutions to climate change. And so this is a really low-hanging fruit, I would say, for governments in the region to really think about how to fund their needs, but at the same time also flow money into these things that are vital to their survival. And there's a lot of examples out there of things that we can learn. Really, I think the Dutch is a great example.
Jose Daniel, let me come back to you now. I mean, as you look around the region from your vantage point in Honduras, do you see anybody who's doing this especially well, or at least has gotten off to a good start, and why? Why have they been successful?
Yes, Brian. Well, I think that Costa Rica is a good example. It has been mentioned previously in this conversation. So in terms of climate mitigation, they have their national decarbonization plan, which helps a lot. But at the end of the day, it has also encountered a lot of barriers in terms of, okay, so the benefits are not probably on the short terms, and the IDB has made some studies that if they actually execute that plan, they will have a lot of net benefits towards 2050. And in terms of adaptation, they are a constant studied case in terms of the paying for the ecosystem services, which at the end of the day help people generate an income, which I do believe could be really beneficial in terms of the economic side of and social part, but also in terms of the environment. So from my vantage point of view, it's Honduras, and Reina probably, well, not probably, she knows a lot of Honduras. It's a country like many in the region that it's becoming, or it's having a big problem in terms of deforestation. So I do believe that solutions such as those ones, tropicalized, sort of say, to the particular reality on the ground, could prove beneficial to places like Honduras and other countries which are suffering from this type of phenomena. I would just like to point out, Brian, something that Laura said in terms of the potential for nature-based solutions, which I do believe they have a really low cost. And normally, you find people, or in terms of on the ground here in Honduras, people tend to think that gray infrastructure is the only way out towards incremental resiliency and reducing vulnerability. And it's part of the solution, of course, but there are plenty of other options like nature-based solutions that have a low cost and could actually, I do believe, have a great effect in terms of recuperating that social tissue that has been lost due to many other factors such as violence, inequality, and poverty. But it has to be done well. So yeah, I just wanted to point that, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Daniel. And you mentioned something that I neglected to point out for the benefit of our audience, which is that Reina, you are from Honduras. I mean, do you have any reaction to any of what Jose Daniel or Laura just said?
Yes, thank you, Brian. I believe that to leverage the potential of nature, the public sector must build a fertile environment through policies, through regulations, and other financial incentives. We will need to help build the capacities of projects developers and local communities, so they can incorporate nature-based solutions, as Jose Daniel was mentioning, and that is key. And we've seen it, but you mentioned at the beginning too. It's yes, we need to motivate, but we need to do more. The figures are big. The impact is significant. So yes, we have to cover all the areas, and there's a lot of efforts, but we need to start, bringing top down, bigger projects. But also do not forget that the ones that suffer the most, and especially Central America, are the areas that are most vulnerable, most poor, and a lot of times less served. With the IDB has been instrumental in helping identify this risk in trainings, in technical cooperations, in supporting the awareness of this matter. So I couldn't agree with you more than Jose Daniel, and with Laura, definitely. And that's what I say. Some companies still don't understand the risk benefits, on adaptation. It's not as easy as it may seem. So we have to walk together to join the game. The commitment, it's big, and it's a big responsibility for all of us.
Reina, thank you. We're taking your questions now in the Q&A feature. So again, if anyone who's joining us via Zoom, I know we've got a lot of folks watching via social media as well. On Zoom, the Q&A chat will get it to us. This is a question that I suppose I would take to Laura first. The question is, it's a good one, it's a topical one. How are higher inflation rates and the possibility, at least, of a global downturn in the economy affecting demand and the prospects for these green bonds that we keep talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say a couple of things here. The vast majority of the sort of inflationary trends that we're seeing today are supply driven. And they're in large part driven by three things: energy costs, housing, and food. And all those three are very linked to the way that our economy is wired, which is 90% of the energy we use is fossil based. So our view is that obviously this is a very critical juncture, and it's really complicated to read markets right now. Let me tell you, this year has been really a wild ride. But I would say I think that we sort of our position is that we think that what's happening today with the conflict in Ukraine and the pressure that that's putting on Europe in particular to shift away from fossil fuels, we think that that will be an accelerant to the transition and not slow it down. Clearly, we're at a point where we see some of the lack of investments in certain areas in the past few years are causing some of these price pressures, but we think that that should abate within the next 12 to 18 months. I think one thing that worries me more than the inflationary pressures is really more the fact that there seems to be a little bit of a pushback, as is frequent in times of crisis, around the idea that climate considerations should be an important part of how policy is handled, especially economic policy, and part of the investment consideration. So that sort of worries me a little bit, and I hope that that's just a blip that won't continue. I think the debate around how we should do this is really important, but I think that, I always bring it back to the findings of the IPCC report, especially the sixth one that was released over the past few months. The one on science that was released last fall says, if I had to boil it down to one word, the science is unequivocal, so there's no debate about that. The one on the impacts of climate change that came out in February this year, pretty scary. If I had to boil it down to one word, I would say the impacts are irreversible. There's only so much we can do to reverse what's happened so far. The best we can do is try to drive emissions down and then adapt, hence the topic of this conversation. And then the third is that the window for mitigation is also narrowing fairly quickly, especially mitigation avoiding the worst effects of climate change. Obviously, there's different scenarios, but the ones that would allow us to sort of a narrow window of getting through this, accepting some climate change, but also avoiding the worst while driving the economy towards low emissions. So there's a really small window there, and I really hope that current crises and events aren't going to distract us from the prize in the end.
Yeah, because as you say, the science is clear, but $100 barrel in oil is a heck of an incentive. Right. Yes. And for a lot of these countries, especially the ones in the region that, we have a mix in the region of countries that export and import, yes. But for all of them, you can have a framework that's functioning well, but when you change the underlying macroeconomic conditions, it can be pretty disruptive. But to be clear, I heard you say that at least at a global level, you don't yet see a massive change in this sector in terms of what's happening.
No, I think that the trend towards an economy that is shifting away from fossil fuels is clear. The question is the pace of that transition. And I think on that we can debate endlessly how quickly it's happening. Clearly not quickly enough to meet the global climate goals set by the Paris Agreement. Well, I think the question of whether there will be a reversal, I think I would put the probability of that as very, very low. Currently, our thinking is that this is just happening, period. And so when we think about how to navigate this context for our clients, obviously it's tricky because, again, the speed of this, how quickly it'll happen, will there be policy support, how quickly societies will react. I think that's an important piece of the puzzle as well, right? As we continue experiencing these disruptive climate events, I think that the pressure from people, because look, the choices are three, right? As scientists say, it's mitigating, it's adapting, or it's suffering. We're not spending enough on adaptation. We're not clearly moving quickly enough on mitigation. So that means that it's the suffering part that goes up, unfortunately, right? And so I think that at some point, we'll get to a point where societies break over this. There will be a breaking point. The pressure on policy will be I think, a very important part of how this gets done. I would think, to do it in a less disruptive way, I would really hope that policymakers can act with decisiveness, providing clear signals, obviously, which I think the private sector needs. But, obviously it's still treacherous waters ahead, but I don't see a reversal in the trend.
Thank you. We have about 5 to 10 minutes left, and I'd like to close with basically asking each of you to address kind of one final question. Council of the Americas, which of course is one of the parent organizations of America's Quarterly, has more than 200 corporate members. We circulated this invitation to this event today widely, and we were struck by how much interest there was amongst a variety of entities, energy companies, banks, investment funds, the diplomatic community, multilateral organizations. I mean, the take-up was quite huge. I know we have a large audience watching us on some social media platforms right now as well. It seems like a lot of what we've been talking about today has been directed toward the public sector. And that makes complete sense to me because usually they're the ones who have to create the right environment for these things. But Laura, just to stay with you and come to you first on this, what advice or what words would you impart to people in the private sector from a variety of perspectives who are interested for a variety of reasons in getting more involved in this space, possibly steering funding toward it, but either haven't quite figured out how or just haven't been able to push enough into this sector quite yet?
So I would say that one of the things that we are desperately need more of in this space is more information. So one good way to start, if you're a company in the region, for example, is to really think about your own operations and first, your vulnerabilities to some of the effects of climate change. Second, your contribution to emissions, for example. How do you measure this, right? Start thinking about the small scale individual company. How can I think about what are the risks? How am I managing those risks? How am I contributing to climate change? We as investors are hungry for that information that goes into disclosures, that goes into how we think about investment decisions in companies. And I think that highlights pockets of opportunities for companies to really think about what can they do to limit downside risks, but also contributing positively to the solutions. Because that's really, Larry Fink always talks about how the next billionaire or trillionaire will be someone who comes up with climate technologies that solve some of the problems that we aren't able to solve today. And I think that's really true. And so really sort of focus on that lens, I think, is really important.
All right, thank you. Jose Daniela, coming to you with the same question. I know that you come at this from the perspective of somebody who's working for the UN, who's there on the ground, but what has your experience been in interactions with members of the private sector, and what ideas do you have for getting more people involved with this cause? I mean, in some ways, it is a cause. It's an utterly practical one, but it has that element to it.
Yes, as you mentioned, I don't come from the private sector side of perspective, but I do believe that it is important that the private sector, engages in this topic more productively, more actively. I do believe that the Summit of the Americas might be a good place to do that. Leaving aside the political uncertainty that we have in terms of the summit, in terms of the region itself, I do believe it might be a good place where the region's private sector could actually sit on the table, discuss elements such as the one Laura just said about information. Because at the end of the day, for example, in Neta and Iota, that it was a private sector that it had to suffer the most from the economic impacts from those hurricanes. So it's in their benefit to actually involve in this part. And I do think that as long as we have more information, there will be more options in terms of where they can invest. And I think it is critical for them to have these policy instruments in order to have certainty, not only in the short term, but also in the medium and long term. So I believe Reina said that, it's really important that rules don't change along the game. So I do believe we have some space of opportunity in there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jose Daniel. And then Reina, let me give you the last word on this. And you come at this from the perspective of someone in a very important position at a multilateral organization, a multilateral lender right now. But of course, prior to that, you were working at a very large bank in the private sector. So what advice or wisdom or words would you impart to people who have some interest, have some money, but are not quite sure yet how and where to get involved?
Yeah, Brian, I just want to mention something, and it's very important that where we are now, we cannot go back. I think that COVID has been a loud and clear call to consider all risk, included climate risk. And this is an opportunity to focus and work together on a green recovery. I understand, and I have to remind everyone that this is a responsibility of all of us. Our main incentive is the preservation of the planet. And I don't want to take this away from the focus, which at the end, this will translate to protecting the lives of our peoples and livelihoods of our communities. So we can say that we are in a mission here. Of course, every sector has different motivations, incentive to achieve this goal. And I know adaptation is, as Laura was saying, the P&L is not very easy to see. The public sector can do this on its own. We need to work together to build more resilient solutions. And the private sector needs policy, regulations, clarity for planning, long-term investments. And I mentioned before, let's not change the rules of the game while we have already started. And the financial institutions, I mean, we're here to work with both ends and to help set these targets, these timelines, and redirect investment, to nature and climate resilience projects. So we have to also innovate through science, technology. But what I want to call the attention is that we have to build the nature culture around this. I can speak as the IDB group. We're doing our part. We want to help through our IDB Invest arm, the private part, the government. We're committed to align all the operations, to the Paris Agreement by 2023, and it is our priority to put nature and climate at the heart of this recovery agenda. So ask, as Laura was mentioning, there are funding available. Sometimes we just don't know how to get it. Get to your local bank. We do, and this is no promotion, but we do have IDB offices representation in 26 member countries in the region. There is a plenty of resources, and not only funding, but technical assistance and support on listening. What do we need to for the government to have this fertile environment, to have the investment that is needed for the green recovery, as we call it. So ask, seek, and I believe that you will find this has gained too much importance. I mean, between January and November 2021, the global finance commitments to net zero grew from $5 trillion to $130 trillion. That amount is huge. And in the same period, the number of countries that committed to zero commitments also grew dramatically, from 21 to 140 countries. So these commitments definitely will impact the demand on climate financing. So the game has started, and we're here to support each one from our end, and from the IDB group. We're here to walk the way and do it together. So thanks, thank you, Brian.
Oh, that's right. I mean, IDB has shown a big commitment to this one. And as you point out, there's a lot of money out there and a lot of need too. And hopefully our conversation today helped connect some of those things a little more. It's a conversation that I'm sure will continue. So Reina, Laura, Jose Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. A copy of this conversation will be available on the Americas Quarterly website, as well as on YouTube and on the site of the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas. Thank you again to our partners at SEBRI, with whom we hosted today's event, and to all of you for being here to discuss this very important topic. Thanks again. Have a good day.
Thank you, Brian. Bye.
Thank you.
My name is John Otis. I'm based in Bogota, Colombia, but I pretty much cover most of Latin America. Flying into Honduras after getting into the airport, it was about a 4.5 hour drive. The town isn't such great shakes. I mean, it's this normal little burg, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. But the real beauty of the area is kind of the outlying area, the area surrounding the town. It's these rolling hills and mountains that are covered mostly with coffee fincas, and the coffee country out there is just really beautiful. Ariel Benitez, the mayor of San Juan, was really one of the very first mayors in Honduras to take it seriously, and along with some help with some NGOs, he helped put together one of Honduras's first climate adaptation plans. The climate adaptation plan is pretty straightforward. It's not this big bureaucratic tome. It's 29 pages. It's actually quite readable, and that's a good thing because it's something that the peasant farmers who live in and around San Juan can actually read and understand, and it can help prevent coffee rust, which is this terrible plague that has wiped out millions of acres of coffee over the decades. Farmers had set up a community bank, and they were giving out small loans so people could try their hands at setting up little businesses. Some people were using the fruits that they had planted, like blackberries and oranges and pineapples, and fermenting them into wine and selling the wine for $6 a bottle, and they were making a good little side income on that. Some other folks we met up with there had set up a bakery, which doesn't sound anything too sophisticated, but it was really the only bakery in that part of the countryside. I met Otilia Aguilar. She and her husband had 4 young children, and several years back they lost their whole crop to the coffee rust plague, and they were pretty determined to pull up stakes and head towards the United States. In the end, they ended up staying because they didn't want to leave their 4 kids behind. Again, having a little bit of cash is really important in adapting to climate change, and they were able to plant some new strains of coffee that held up better to coffee rust, and plant some other crops as well.
Recording stopped.